Good morning or welcome everybody to another webinar within our Agora webinar series. Today's event is about Germany's long goodbye from coal, and it's the 11th event since we started on 9th of April. Now, who do you see on the podium? We have Philip Litz, he's Project Manager International Coal Transition at the Team International of Agora Energiewende. We have Pao-Yu Oi, who is head of the research group Coal Exit and the corresponding Coal Transitions Research Hub at the Technische Universität Berlin, TU Berlin. There's also Hauke Hermann, who's a senior researcher at the Öko-Institut. Then you see Janne Görlach, who's trainee at the communications department of Agora Energiewende. I'm head of events at Agora Energiewende, and very much looking forward to today's webinar. We're currently looking at some 160 participants, and for what's going to happen during the next 1.5 hours is we will have a presentation of the three of Pao-Yu, Philip, and Hauke for some 40 to 45 minutes, and then we will have a lot of time for your questions, and we will have a Q&A session which will be moderated by Janne. We also have prepared a big bunch of polls to get into interaction with you a bit more during the webinar, because even though we're all probably a bit more used to virtual events now, what I'm still missing is to actually meet you and see you. So we try to get as much as possible out of Zoom. Apart from that, now how can you interact with us? If you look at the bottom of your screen, you have two buttons, the chat button and the Q&A or F&A button. The chat button you will probably know from other providers of online events. You can basically put all your technical issues in there. So if you have problems hearing or seeing, or if you have a question regarding the presentation or anything, you can put it in there. We will use the chat to communicate important links to you. Janne has already posted the links to the presentations, which you can already find online on our website, into the chat, and she will also put email addresses and other important stuff into the chat. So this is for technical issues and important links, whereas the Q&A section is reserved for your content-related questions. So anything that comes up to your mind during the presentation or already, also put it in there. Janne will have a look at it, and also Philip, Pao-Yu, and Hauke, to make sure that we can answer as many as possible at the end of the webinar, because so far we've always had a lot more questions than we were actually able to answer. So put any content-related questions into the Q&A section. Once they have been picked, they will become visible for the audience. We will make them visible. So, and that brings me to the next point. We are recording the webinar. You can see that in the top left, because we want to make it available for people who cannot attend right now. So it will be on the website afterwards. Now, what does that mean for your Q&As? If you put a question in there and we pick it to be answered, then it will become visible and it will be read out to the audience. So it will also be on the recording. So if you do not want to leave any footprints in the World Wide Web, you must refrain from the Q&As, I'm afraid. Right, that's for the housekeeping. Now, before I hand over to Philip to start with the presentation, we did prepare a poll to get to know you a little better, and I will open it, and you should be able to see it right now. I will read it out because polls are not being recorded, and some people may not see it depending on which device you're logged in. So what is your professional background? Is it A, energy industry, B, policy or government, C, finance, economy, D, NGO, so non-government organization, or E, other? And then the second question is about where you're coming from or where you're located. Is it A, Africa, B, Americas, C, Asia, D, Australia, or E, Europe. And you cannot see the results, but I can see that people are still voting. So I give it another 2 to 3 seconds before I finish. Anyone else who wants to vote? Okay, I finish here, and you should be able to see the results right now. So we can see regarding the professional background, we have a majority of 40% from others, followed by energy industry, surprise, surprise, with 22%. We have 18% of NGO representatives, 17% of policy government, and a small minority of 3% from finance and economy. Well, that wasn't too surprising, I guess. Where do you come from? Okay, I think our marketing works best in Europe because we have 86% people joining in from Europe, but we also have 9% from Asia, 3% from Africa, 1% from the Americas, and even someone from Australia. So hello to Down Under. But before I go into that, I will hand over to Philip. Finish this so it doesn't appear on your screen, and I hand over to Philip.
All right, thank you very much, Nicola, and also a warm welcome from my side. What we want to do today is to give you a brief overview on the German coal phase out. Clearly a webinar is not sufficient to reflect every detail of that, but what we at least try to do is give you a comprehensive picture, what has been happening, what's still happening, and what we are expecting a little bit for the future. We would also provide you with additional literature. You can find them at the end of the presentation, so you can read on if you want to. How we separated the work amongst us is basically that Pao Yu from DIW will give you an overview on Germany's coal phase out from hard coal mining and the lessons learned from Germany with regards to structural change in those mining regions. I will then take over and give you an overview on the role of lignite and hard coal, what are they still playing within the German energy and especially the power sector, and also have a look on the recommendations of the German Coal Commission from roughly 1.5 years ago. And then I will hand over to Hauke, who will give you some insights on what the government is, based on this recommendation, actually planning to implement at the moment. And after that, we are happy to take all your questions. So before we start with Pao Yu, once again, back to Nicola.
Because we've prepared another poll, I did tell you. So let me just call it. Now, this one's about drivers and hurdles, and you should be able to see it now. So first question, and you can give 2 answers. The question is, what were the biggest drivers for a coal phase out in Germany? You can name up to 2. The possible answers are A, new technological solutions, B, fight against climate crisis, C, economic reasons, D, health and environmental concerns. Remember, you can choose 2 of them. Second question, what were the biggest hurdles for coal phase out in Germany? Again, you can name 2. Answer A is lack of studies. Answer B, replacement of electricity, so the question of security of supply. C, employment aspects. D, public acceptance. Or E, strengths of incumbents. Again, you can vote for up to 2. And then the last question, this time it's single choice. The question is, when was the steepest cut in employment in Germany's coal sector? A, before 1980, B, between 1980 and 2000, C, between 2000 and 2020, or D, still to come. And because there are a lot of questions and you probably want to think about it, we will give it some more time. Okay. Make your choice. Can still see people voting. Always the question when to stop a vote, a poll. Okay, now it looks like it's getting quieter, so I will finish the poll and will make the results available for you. Now, we can see question 1, biggest drivers. A majority voted for fight against climate crisis, 78%. And then we have 39% who voted for economic reasons, 31% for new technological solutions, and 34, there I mix it up actually, on the third place is health and environmental concerns with 34% and 31% new technological solutions. Biggest hurdles, 67% voted for employment aspects, followed by strength of incumbents with 56%. Then replacement of electricity, so security of supply reasons, 47%. 60% think of named public acceptance, and then lack of studies was 1%. And then the last one was the steepest cut in employment in Germany. So most of you think it was between 1980 and 2000, 31%, so a third, followed by 28% who went for before 1980, and then 24% think it was between 2000 and 2020, and 18% think this is still to come. Now, a lot of food for thought. I will hand over to you, Paul Yu, and close the poll.
Thank you very much. Okay, so let me share my screen with you. Let's see whether this works. Okay, so perfect. So I think you should be able to see my screen. So first of all, I will not tell you directly which answer is correct and which answer is wrong, because we're not back in high school where there's a definite right and wrong. Maybe with respect to your last question, it would be more possible to say an exact right or wrong, like what was the steepest cut in employment. I will come back to that, but with respect to the others, it might be even that if you have several experts on a plenum, that you might not necessarily be able to reach a consensus what has been the most important hurdle or the most important driver for a coal phase-out. So it's not always about being right or wrong, but it depends a lot on your different perception and maybe also on your own opinion, what you value as more important and from which perspective you might evaluate this. So, but I don't want to jump too much into the context, but I would like to start from the beginning onwards. And my role, as Philip has indicated, is to go back in time, because I think most of you might have heard a lot already about coal, but I might think that you probably have heard more about the recent history of coal, speaking in the last 5 years, maybe the last 10 to 15 years, for example. And then taking up also one of the claims that was taken in the answers, that climate has been the biggest driver for the coal phase-out in Germany. I think it depends a lot what you're talking about. You see in my presentation slides here 2 pictures, which have happened very recently in Germany, and these are of course driven by climate aspects. This is out of question. However, the work that I'm presenting, it's not only work also by myself, but I'm several members of our research group Coal Exit, and feel free to look at other resources from us as well. But I want to draw you back a bit more in history and basically look at the last 70 years. And therefore, I think it's important to remember where we as Europeans come from. And this is some people forget, which is understandable. The European coal and steel community was the predecessor of the European Union. So the only reason why we have the European Union, which is the founder of peace and prosperity in Europe, you might say so, is based on the union of coal and steel community to bring forward economic growth and prosperity to especially hard coal regions in Germany as well. So therefore, you have to understand that the identification of many people in Germany, but also in other regions in Europe, is being built on these aspects that these people, these miners, have contributed a lot to peace and to economic growth in many different regions, also in Germany. And this is something why people are very proud of the work that they did. And this is something that we, including myself, coming more from a climate perspective, sometimes tend to forget. And this then creates certain pressure between different stakeholder groups, because some people that have worked in the coal business for the last 50 years do not feel sufficiently respected for the work that they have done that has contributed to where we are at the moment. And what you can see in this graph, I will try to guide you through, is basically, let me try to use this option of pointing. So basically you can see two different lines. You can see the upper line. This is the hard coal production, which has been exceeding 150 million tons and then basically was reaching zero in 2019 because the last hard coal mine, these are deep cast mines, was closed in the end of 2018. And you can see the number of employees in hard coal mining, 600,000 direct employees in hard coal mining only, which was reduced also close to zero in 2019. So this is something that some people tend to forget, that when we are talking about coal, basically in 2018, 2019, 2020, we forget what has happened already. And what we see is that hard coal production as well as the employment has been reduced already a lot. Also, what you can see in this time frame is that there have been a lot of things that happened during the meantime. You can maybe go through some of these events individually, but these are just some indications of the Ruhr area and the Saarland, which have been the two most important hard coal regions in Germany, that have led to a more or less successful phase out and structural change programs within these areas. So we're not talking about replacing coal with renewables, but we are talking about replacing coal with other businesses. And this is something that is not happening in the last 10 years, but this is something that has happened within the last 50 to 60 years. Also, something that you might observe when you look at these lines is that it is a relatively constant decline of production, and it is a bit steeper reduction of employees at the beginning, and then a more steady decline throughout the last 50 years, basically. So it is not such an abrupt shock. It also looks very different if you would look at lignite. This is something I just want to indicate here, but I'm focusing here a bit more on hard coal. Why do I focus on hard coal? Because so much more people were working in the hard coal area. And also the prospect of hard coal, I think, can be more easily compared to other happenings in Europe, if you look, for example, to the UK. Also, something that is important is maybe to think of why did we observe this change and what was the reason for this? And this was also one of the questions that I had asked you beforehand, like what was the reason, what was the driver for this coal phase out? Because it has already basically happened in a lot of areas. The hard coal mining phase out has happened. The hard coal production phase out, like the consumption of coal is still being continuous, and this is something that I will talk later on about, but this is basically what we're talking about. Also then speaking to the next thing, why did this happen? One of the drivers was basically that hard coal phase out was economically driven. And we were basically replacing domestic hard coal by imported hard coal. So we stopped using domestic coal because it was too expensive, and we switched to imported hard coal from Colombia, South Africa, the US, and Russia mostly. And why did we do this? Because of prices. And if you look at the price statistics, this is price statistics of the last 70 years, you can see of domestic hard coal, this is the price, you can see it on the left margin, and you see the price of imported coal, which is changing. However, something that is very clearly observable, if I would ask my students from economics, at what point in time would you as a business operator of a hard coal power plant decide to switch from domestic hard coal to imported hard coal? They would probably tell me, well, there's a point here, maybe in the early 60s, when it makes already sense, but then maybe you're uncertain, you have your suppliers, you know them, maybe they're more trustworthy, maybe the quality is better, so you maybe stick with them. But then in the 70s, you suddenly reach a point where coal that is being imported from the outside is twice as cheap. So then it's maybe the last point in time where you would switch. And then you see that this discrepancy gets even bigger. So basically, in sometimes you have that imported coal costs only 1/5 of domestic coal. And this continues basically. And this is then the point in time where you might think back, but he just told me that the hard coal mining phase out didn't happen in the 70s, it didn't happen in the 80s, it didn't happen in the 90s. It happened in 2018, which basically means, in other words, that still in the 2000s, power plants kept using the domestic hard coal, even though it was so much more expensive than the imported coal. And this happened for decades. And this is something to understand. And what you can see in this graph, it's a bit different from the first graph you had seen. It's basically, once again, the employment is this line. You can see the mining, the production volume, basically in Germany. This is this red figure. And then you can see the imported volumes. So basically what you can see is that at the beginning, we were only importing small amounts of hard coal, but then the imports increased. And especially in these periods in the 2000s, because the difference is that big, we switched mostly to imports. However, what you can see within this graph is, first of all, not every hard coal ton was replaced by imports. So the overall amount of used coal is being reduced. Why did we reduce it? Not mostly for climate reasons, but for economic reasons. There was a switch, there was higher efficiency, there was outsourcing of entire business cycles to other countries, etc. So there's a lot of reasons. But still, you can see that the amount of domestically used coal is still relatively high, considering that it's so expensive to use this coal. And why did we do this basically? One of the reasons is simply because it was being subsidized. So if you were a hard coal operator, you basically were able to choose whether you wanted domestic coal or whether you wanted imported coal. If you would use domestic coal, it would be much more expensive. However, the federal government basically gave you a compensation so that in the end you would pay the same amount. So basically there were enormous subsidies being paid by the state. It's difficult to actually quantify them, but we estimated around 300 billion euros for direct and indirect hard coal subsidies. So if we are sometimes talking about the subsidies for renewables, we do not have to forget that there were much higher subsidies for hard coal in the past. It's just that no one really talked about it. So basically the reason why we did this, it was nothing to do with technological reasons. It was just purely for the fact that we wanted to limit socio-economic effects within the coal regions. And this was basically the driver for the development. If you look at the number of jobs only within the last 30 to 40 years, what you can see in this chart is basically the black grayish colors, these ones. These are the jobs, hard coal, direct and indirect, mining and power plants. And in the brownish colors, you can see lignite, mining, direct and indirect, and as well as the power indicated as well. And what you can see is that the number of jobs was reduced already a lot then also in the 1990s. So when we were asking you when was the biggest decline in employment, we saw that the biggest decline actually was already in the 60s, 70s because of hard coal. But then with respect to lignite in the 90s, we see a huge decline. You see these volumes here are being decreased a lot. And this is also due to the unification and all this procedure. What you can also see is that in the last years, the number of jobs in the coal sector continues to be decreased, but anyhow, we are very low levels compared to where we used to be. And then one important question is always, what happened to hard coal? What was the switch there? Did we switch to renewables? What happened to the electricity being produced? And within this line, you can see the share of produced electricity. It is on the right-hand axis, and you can see it was reduced from 60% to more or less 40% of electricity being produced. Actually now, just today, Philip will probably tell you about it later on, we have reached even lower levels. But this was what happened in the last 40 years, basically. The share of electricity produced by coal was only reduced a bit. The number of employees was reduced much more. This is efficiency, but this is especially globalization because we started importing even more coal. Very often people like to present it in a way that they say it's coal versus renewables. It's renewables taking away the jobs of coal. And therefore, I think it's important to look at the uptake of renewables, because if someone claims that renewables did take away all these jobs of coal, then they're exaggerating the importance of renewables. Because basically in the year 2000, there were still a lot of voices in Germany which basically said more than 4% of renewables in the electricity grid is not possible. And this is actually what we see until 2000, but then the renewables take up, and now we have 40% in this year, but actually in 2020, we are now observing more than 55% of electricity being produced by renewables. So basically the uptake of renewables only happened at a stage when coal was already down. It's not renewables that push coal down, but it's basically coal that was on a declining end, and then renewables started to increase. So basically it's more that the going down of coal enabled new actors to rise up, I would say, and it's not that renewables were strong enough to push coal down. We would otherwise overemphasize the importance of renewables in the past. If you look at the renewables, of course, something that is to be mentioned is that also new jobs were being created by renewables. You can see these in these colorful colors. We don't have data in the 1990s, otherwise there would probably be small bars down here, especially with respect to hydro jobs. But in the newest years, you can see that the number of jobs in the renewable sector is now more than 300,000. So it's a remarkable number of jobs. However, you can also see that some of the jobs sometimes are being shifted. You see huge increase in jobs in the sector of PV. These are these yellow indicated bars. However, this bar is being reduced a lot, as a lot of these jobs were basically being shifted to China when it became much cheaper to produce PV panels in China. So this is something always to be kept in mind. Therefore, looking a bit at the reasons, and I would like to phrase it as a lock-in inertia of coal incumbents, of coal regions, of actors that are working within this regime. And I like to think of these actors not as someone who doesn't want to change, but as someone who feels it's very difficult to change for a lot of different reasons. And one of the things that we've analyzed in our studies is that especially at the beginning, people like to focus on these technical aspects, energy security issues. These are the perceived hard aspects that have to be answered. And this is something which I totally understand. I'm an engineer by training, and I can clearly say that all our studies indicate that it is technically possible to phase out coal, not only in Germany, but in all countries. However, you have to come up with new electricity sources, which is renewables, but this is possible. And so therefore, this basically, there's check, and this has been done. And this is why once we had answered this question, a lot of other questions popped up, which will be answered also partly by Philip and by Hauke later on in respect to the German Coal Commission, etc. But I'm just mentioning these terms. Employment aspects, of course, very important. Sometimes within the political aspect, the short-sightedness of election terms, we're speaking of managing a transition for the next 20 years and of the last 70 years. So this is a long-term prospect that you have to keep in mind, and election terms are in most cases only 4 to 5 years. Economic aspects, the disruption of business concepts. You would expect a company to think maybe not 70 years, but at least 10 to 20 years ahead, and not only with respect to the annual figures of the next outcome. Something that is very often forgotten is that the identification with coal mining is understandably very high in coal regions. This is why I wanted to start off with 1950 with the inauguration of the European Coal and Steel Community. If you've been brought up with the belief that you were important for the uptake of economic growth within your country, and then suddenly the next generation tells you that you're not needed anymore, this feels very bitter. So therefore, I think it is important to explain to the people that we are very thankful for everything that they've done, but that it's now a time for a change to a new Green Deal that will basically enable a shift. And then, of course, every change comes along with distributional effects that have to be kept in mind. So this is, of course, very understandable and has to be taken into consideration. I just want to finish basically with a short advertisement on a lot of works that we have done because I had to cut my presentation short. So therefore, these are just 3 publications on these aspects which try to indicate some of them. All, of course, are open access. And then indicating just also that it's not me myself working on this topic, but it's a lot of international researchers working on a lot of different topics. We try to collect all the studies on coaltransitions.org with a lot of organizations highlighting of different aspects, because the stories of Germany are important, I think. However, there are even more important stories of other countries that have to be told. So this is why I encourage everyone to go on these websites, look at us, follow us, and ask questions, and we try to share our knowledge as open as possible. And therefore, this is it from my side. I would like to close on this, and I'm looking forward to all these questions. I'm looking forward to the discussions afterwards, and also, of course, to the input of my fellow colleagues. So thank you very much. I hope I wasn't too fast, but nevertheless, anyhow, the slides are also online, and I will answer questions. So therefore, I hope things go smoothly. So thank you very much. And I'm handing on to the next person, who I think is Nicola again.
Yes, correct. Because we've prepared another poll for you before Philip starts his part of the presentation. Right. Next poll, Philip on shares. And you should be able to see it right now. I will read out the questions again. Number 1, what was the share of lignite and hard coal in Germany's power mix in 2019? What do you think? A, 63%, B, 45%, C, 28%, or D, 14%? And obviously this time is single choice. Second question, what share of renewables in the power sector in Germany I read it again. What share of renewables in the power sector is Germany aiming to reach by 2030? Answer number A, 80%, B, 65%, C, 55%, or D, 45%. And I can still see that people are voting. So let's wait a little more. Anyone else? Come on. Okay, looks like everyone's made up his or her mind, and I will finish and publish the results. So the share of lignite and hard coal in Germany's 28% think more than half of you, 53%. 35% of the audience think it's 45% of lignite and hard coal share in Germany's power mix in the last year. 8% think it was 40%, 14%, and 3% of you think it was 63%. And we'll probably see a bit more about this later on. Share of renewables in the power sector. What is Germany aiming for by 2030? 58%, so more than half think it's 65%. And then we have 19% thinking it's 55% versus 18% thinking it's 80%. And then 4% of you think it's 45%. Now, I'm curious if Philip can give us some more light on this topic. And I will close the poll. Philip, to you.
All right. Thank you, Nicola. I hope you're all seeing my screen now. It seems the questions have been a little bit too easy, or it only reflects that our audience today is mainly European, because both the majorities of the question were actually answered right. But more to that in a few minutes. So first of all, I would like to give you an overview on the role of coal in Germany's energy system today, where we're basically standing. When we take a look at the primary energy consumption within Germany, you see that it's currently, these are 2018 numbers, 2019 is not substantially lower, but we have reached a level of around a fifth of total primary energy consumption is coming from hard coal. The rest is mainly fossil fuels, which means oil, roughly 40%, with gas and some nuclear. Renewables now come up to 15–16%, something like that. So when we talk about the long picture of the energy transition, still a pretty long to go for Germany. What is the coal actually used for? What you can see here is most of the lignite, almost 100%, is basically used for power and heat production, while hard coal, on the other hand, only to a third is used actually in power plants. The rest third is basically used in the industry sector, used for chemicals production, but also especially steel and aluminium. With regards to the power sector, last year to the end of 2019, Germany has reached a coal share of total of 28%, which is the lowest within 4 years. You've just seen the share of around 40–45%, which was still the case in 2015 that Paul Ewers just showed you. And the reason for that is basically increase in share of renewables over the last couple of years. Last year we had we reached a share of 40%, and this development is probably even increasing in the year 2000. The first quarter, the first 4 or 5 months for German coal have been pretty tough due to lower demand due to the corona crisis, very, very low gas prices, still relatively stable CO2 price. And this has turned out to really push out hard coal and lignite even further. The first quarter was basically down hard coal lignite by another 50% compared to the year before. So we really see where we're going to land at the end of this year. Where do we stand when it comes to employment? Just to catch up on that a little, and also include the mining and the lignite sector. We are currently well below 30,000 employees in hard coal and mining sector. In mining, it's around 50,000 still in the lignite sector. You have to get rid of the 4,000 people, which are still listed here at the end of 2018 in the hard coal sector, are now mainly out of work. And in power plants, it's roughly between roughly around 13,000 employees, most of them working in hard coal plants, few less in the lignite sector. So where is the current debate actually standing, or where was it standing 1.5 years ago? So as you might know, in June 2018, the German government implemented the German Coal Commission, which was the result of a long discussion for decades in Germany, mainly, or at least for 15 years, how to phase out the coal power generation for power and heat in the German energy sector, and how to meet its climate targets. So the Coal Commission was mandated, which basically consisted of interest groups like environmental associations, like administration, but also scientists, trade unions, utility associations, industry, and so on and so forth. And their mandate was to develop a phase-out plan and also additional measures which are necessary for Germany to meet its climate targets. At this point, we were at the reduction level of -30% and the climate target of 2020 of -40%, and the climate target for 2030 of -55% was clearly in danger, and everybody expected that Germany will not meet these climate targets. And what the Commission came up with after half a year of intense discussion is basically a strategy along 5 elements. The first is obviously a phase-out plan, which suggested that in first place that no new coal-fired plants and mines should be opened, and on the other hand, to shut down all existing plants step by step until 2035 or 2038, the latest. This is how the phase-out plan actually should have looked. So reduce the business as usual development of the existing capacities to 30 gigawatts in 2022 to 17 gigawatts in total by 2030, and to 0 by 2035, 2038 in the very end. Compared with the expected reference development at that time, this was a substantial increase, but because otherwise we've guessed that not only we at Agora, but all other modelers basically came to very similar results, that otherwise we would have left around 30 gigawatts of coal in the system in 2030 and roughly around 20 gigawatts in 2038. Besides that, a few other elements were important as well. This is first, the B element here is to support this transformation of the traditional mining regions, which basically means setting up funds to which should lead to investment and modernization of the infrastructure, research, and innovation within the regions. Then, as a next element, to modernize the power system, which includes increase in renewables, but also security of supply measures, or monitoring and reserves, and also make the power system itself more flexible by improving grid infrastructure and storage. As a fourth element, to address the potential hardship for those who are directly affected by the coal phase out, meaning to firstly ensure a just transition, which means active labor market policies, but it also means to maintain the competitiveness of industry and also households to a certain extent with power price compensation. It also includes to compensate utilities for the earlier shutdown and to conduct a dialogue with villages who still might be affected by resettlement process. The last element is basically to monitor the process very closely and to review always if everything is going in line, and if needed, to take additional action. So this is what the Coal Commission recommended at that point. And what for me is pretty important if you want to talk about the effects in the power sector is the strategy of phasing out coal capacity and mainly replacing that with renewable energy. So the reduction in the coal sector goes hand in hand with the target of increasing renewables up to 65% in 2030. Sorry. And what this means in the end, if you compare a scenario where you do no additional measures with the compromise suggested by the Coal Commission, is basically that you replace the decrease in coal, what you can see here, with mainly additional renewables. There will also be some additional gas probably in the system, and exports will increase due to the lower wholesale power prices in the German power market, which comes with the increase of renewables, but it's mainly designed as a coal to renewable switch. What does it mean with regards to the climate targets? What we saw in our modeling is that the measures were clearly sufficient to meet the sectoral climate target for 2030 for the power sector, which is already in place. But if we take a look at the total emissions, meaning also including all the other sectors like transport and so on, it was obviously not sufficient to meet the 2030 climate targets. For that, we would need additional measures like in the transport sector, in the building sector, and so on and so forth. Some of them have been addressed already in the climate package half year ago, but as we see, it's probably not sufficient either. Totally different question is, of course, are these measures sufficient to reach international climate targets, where there's huge debate about, in our opinion. This is actually not the case, since we will need actually a more accelerated phase out, but they're at the current level sufficient to meet the sectoral climate targets. So this is basically where we're standing on this. What does it mean with regards to power prices? What you see here is a modeling on three most important parts of end consumer prices, which are wholesale power prices, renewable surcharge, and grid cost, and comparing two scenarios where there's no additional coal phase out and we have the measures in place. And what you can see here is that when we're looking at 2030, we're roughly leveling out, and consumer prices are roughly the same like they are with no coal phase out and with the coal phase out. The reason for that is basically that, as I already said, coal is mainly replaced by renewables. And this means that while wholesale prices are actually decreased through more renewables and the push out of coal, you have additional costs for supporting and financing for renewables. So in the end, we are basically leveling out, and consumer prices are expected to be in roughly the same level in 2030, like without any additional measures. What does it mean for the budget? We have been expecting that the total cost for the federal budget of this phase out sums up to 70 to 90 billion euros, roughly. 40 billion of that would be reserved for regional policies or structural measures. 5 to 7 billions would be needed to allow for labor market policies, such as retraining and early retirement. Around 60 to 30 billion euros would have been reserved for power price compensations. 5 to 10 billions roughly for utility compensations, and 3 to 4 billion to delete CO2 certificates within the European ETS, so that the actual German coal phase out will also be of highest effect within the European power market. So this is it regarding the recommendations of the German Coal Commission and what we expected from that. And I'm now going to give back to Nicola first, and then to Hauke, who will explain a little bit more on what the current government is actually planning to implement precisely.
Yes, and we do have one more poll for you. So you know the game. I'll open it. It's about the good and the bad, I call it. And I'll start it now. You should be able to see it. Yes, you do. I will read out the questions. First one is, what aspects are positive about the German coal phase out? And you can pick two answers. A, the steady decline of capacity. B, no financial compensation for hard coal from 2027. C, no financial compensation for lignite power plants from 2030. And D, replacement of coal combined heat and power, so CHP plants, with gas CHP plants. And you can vote 1 or 2 if you like. Second question, what aspects are negative about the German coal phase out? And again, you can pick 2. A, construction of the Datteln 4 plant. B, delayed closure of lignite power plants. C, questionable decommissioning payments for old lignite plants in the oh my god, I should have tried that earlier. Lusatian region. Oh my god, it's around the corner. It's Lausitz, yeah, but I wouldn't know how to pronounce it in English. Never mind, Lusatian region, I would say. Then D, replacement of coal CHP plants with gas CHP plants. Think about it and hit a button. People are still voting, so I will wait a little more. Okay. There's still movement, so apparently not everyone has made up his or her mind. Let's give it a bit more. Right, okay, I think we come to an end. Oh, there's still movement. Come on, people. Okay, I finish it now. So you should be able to see it. So the most positive aspect about the German coal phase out, in your opinion, with 63% voting for that, is the steady decline of capacity. And then the next one is with 37% that no financial compensation for hard coal from 2027, followed by no financial compensation for lignite power plants from 2030 with 31%, so a third of you voted for that. And then we have 27% who think replacement of coal combined CHP plants with gas CHP plants are positive about the German coal phase out. Now, what about the negative aspects? 66% think the delayed closure of lignite power plants is a negative aspect, followed by 50%, so half of you voted for construction of the Datteln 4 plant, and then 45% questionable decommissioning payments for old lignite plants in the Lusatian region, and then 21% replacement of coal CHP plants with gas CHP plants. And I wonder if we will find out some more about this during Hauke's presentation. Let me finish poll and hand over to Hauke. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think the questionnaire was very interesting. A little bit feedback from you, what you think. I'm going a little bit deeper into the details of the coal phase out. The legislative process is on the way, and I think it will be finished by this summer. Last week there was a hearing. I put the link into the end of the presentation, and it's recorded on YouTube, and so you can see what the different scientists said there. This is already like a summary slide. One of the shortfalls or the changes that were there compared to the Coal Commission proposal was that the steady decline of lignite capacities was not. The Datteln 4 plant will be constructed, and we are missing a little bit out on renewables. There's not so much happening at the moment on renewables. There's questionable payments for the plants in the Lusatian region. I will come back to that later. So that was more the shortfall of the changes to the proposals from the Coal Commission. And the controversies are the decommissioning payments for hard coal power plants, where hard coal power plant operators say these are too low, and also like on how much support should you give to replacement of coal CHP combined heat and power plants. And like all the other issues, all the other measures are more or less in line with the proposed recommendations of the Coal Commission. So if you look on...
Sorry, Hauke, to interrupt you. Maybe you can switch off your video, because I hear there are problems with
graph, you see the steady decline, and most of you...
Hauke, hörst du?
Ja,
Hauke?
ich kann dich hören. Ich muss
okay,
kurz...
let's try without video, because I couldn't hear you properly, and I fear some of the participants may not be able to do so. So we just switch up the video, and you can continue with the presentation. Sorry for interrupting you.
Okay. Yeah, is it better now? So you see here the capacity of the hard coal power plants. Basically, hard coal is decommissioned first, and the lignite capacity is quite steady. We will see that in the next graph. See that lignite is only decommissioned in 2029 and then in 2038. And you see here in 2021 small additional auctions to compensate for Datteln 4. And in the next slide, you see the the yearly decommissionings. So you see what I already explained, that first hard coal is decommissioned, and then in 2028, 29, lignite, the big chunk of lignite is decommissioned. And then we have a lot of lignite plants decommissioned in 2038. Yeah. And of course, financial aspects are important. So the payments for RWE in the Rheinisch area, they start in 2020 when the first plant is decommissioned, and then the payments are for 15 years. And in Eastern Germany, in Lusatia, payments start in 2025 for 15 years when the first plant is decommissioned there. And for hard coal from 2027, there's no payments anymore. Yeah, this is the summary slide on the payments, on the costs. So there are auctions for hard coal fired power plants. The maximum price is 165 euro per kilowatt in 2020, and it decreases to about 50 euros per kilowatt in 2026. And then there's no payments anymore from 2027. Nicola, is it okay from the quality? And then, so for hard coal, there are auctions, and for lignite, there is contracts for decommissioning. And so there's 2.6 billion for RWE and 1.75 billion for LEAG in Lusatia. And what you can see here, like the specific amount of payments is higher for LEAG in Lusatia. And we don't really understand that because these plants are decommissioned later. And if somebody is decommissioned later, then the payment should be lower. And the interesting thing is that was not so discussed widely, that after 2030, there's no decommissioning payments for lignite anymore. So that's also some positive aspects here. So this is the last slide, a little bit of outlook for the German power sector, and sum up what happened also in the last week. I mean, we have currently with this very low gas prices, which have led to a substantial abatement in coal power plants in 2020 and also next year. And for me, this is really interesting to see how far emissions can go down. The rollout of renewable energies is not sufficient. That could go faster. Last week, it's not directly related to the coal phase out, but somehow to the rollout of renewables. We had this EEG surcharge. This reform is on the way. It will be limited, and we hope that public acceptance for renewables will come up. And one other important aspect that will be on the agenda will be the higher target on the EU level, with a more stringent EU ETS cap. And despite the decision that was taken on the coal phase out now, on the capacity, this will also influence production of coal power plants. So there will be some more changes in future. Yeah, thank you very much. This was my presentation, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Hauke, and also Pao Yu and Philip. Let me just repeat that you can still post questions because we are now entering into the Q&A session, which will be moderated by Janne. Pau, can we always have you on the podium? Because I think you managed to already answer some 9 or 10 questions. So at the moment, we still have a few more, of course, but if there's still something that you really would like to know and find out and that you've always wanted to ask, go for it, put it in the Q&A section, because we do have another half an hour left for your questions and remarks. Janne, with this, I hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Nicola, and welcome from my side to the Q&A session. Also, thank you for the presentators for already answering a lot of them. So I think all the questions about understanding the methods of your presentations are clear and answered. So I start with the question from Maren Preuss. Which is about the final phase-out law. What is your impression on it, and when will it be passed? And do you expect any modification to the current draft law? So maybe Philip, you want to start answering this one?
Yeah, maybe Hauke add if you want to. Also, Paul, I would go with Hauke's assumption that will probably be done by the end of the summer, if nothing unprecedented will happen. I guess this is probably rather likely. What are the actual changes that might come out? It's really difficult to say at the moment because we are in the end lobbying game, so to say. We already had the public hearing, public presentations now within the both within the ministry, but also especially within the Bundestag. There are huge discussions. What should be amended, as Hauke already pointed out, the main points are basically what are the compensations for hard coal power plants? Should they get any after 2027 or not? And what is the height of them? If I had to guess, I would probably say it's not unlikely that this gets changed, so that hard coal power plants might get a little more than it's actually that is currently on the table. But I won't expect any major substantial structural changes within the law itself.
Anyone wants to add on this answer?
Yeah, maybe I can add a little bit to this. I also think that on hard coal there was a lot of pressure to get more money out and to increase CHP bonuses there. And like until last year, I would have said, yes, it's very likely that this lobby effort is successful. But at the moment, with this very low gas prices and the very low economic performance of hard coal power plants that are not running a lot at the moment, and gas is so cheap, I think the argument of the hard coal industry is a lot weaker. So I hope that we won't see any changes there, because I don't see it so necessary at the moment. But I think these 2 points, CHP bonus, where people get a little greedy, I think, and hard coal decommissioning payments, I think for new plants, I think this were 2 controversial points. Yeah.
So before getting to more detail, Ursula Hutwilter asked, how true to the Commission recommendations do you assess the current draft law in terms of implementing these? Maybe one would elaborate on that.
Yeah, in my first, maybe Philip and Paul, you can add to that a little bit. So in the first slide, there was this Datteln 4 plant that was decommissioned, that was not in line with the proposal of the Coal Commission. And second, this unsteady decline of lignite power plants, that these are only decommissioned in a big chunk in 2038. I think these are the 2 most problematic points.
Okay, so then we go into more detail about Jürgen Voskuhl asked about the compensations, why we would pay compensation after all. And wouldn't coal-fired power plants already be uneconomic nowadays anyway?
Yeah, also if somebody would like to add on this. So the economic compensation is probably one of the hardest debated, especially amongst the climate scene, so to say. Is it really necessary to pay those compensations? It is in some way kind of a tricky question, because if we come from a legal perspective, this has been discussed for the last 5 years, and what we've seen there is that there have been ways that the government could have enforced a law just phasing out coal power plants without the need of paying compensations. There are also some studies which argue against it, but also some who say, yeah, that's possible, no doubt, if you design the phase-out law like this and like that. Nevertheless, the German government has decided to take another way forward, which basically means to go for a more consensus approach by already setting up the commission itself. And in that regard, it is not really surprising that the commission then came up with a suggestion to phase out coal and also paying compensations. This has been a decision taken already 2.5 years ago. And what we're now in the situation is actually kind of a new or more updated situation, so to say, since CO2 prices are still pretty high, gas prices are very, very low. We've seen that especially hard coal and also lignite power plants are very, very under pressure at the moment when it comes to the market situation, which actually raises the question of, is it really necessary to pay compensations? Aren't they pushed out of the market anyways? So one could argue, yeah, we shouldn't pay any compensation at all, but this in the end would then also mean get rid of the coal compromise completely, because it was part of a package deal which included the paying compensations and so on and so forth. What I wouldn't like to say is that power plants are now completely uneconomic. Some of them are, and they probably get pushed off the market. Some are still pretty economic, because if you still make reference scenarios and modeling throughout 2030, we might still see that those power plants are still online for too long. So it's not only, my understanding, shouldn't only take a look on this from a economic perspective, but also from a political perspective, and either it depends on which side you want to take on this. If you think it's necessary to set up the process once again, or just get rid of it completely. But also interested to see what my other colleagues think about that.
Maybe I can jump on this, and I would firstly agree with everything you say, but maybe also for all the others, because they might not know that Philip as well as Hauke have been part of the commission, so they basically also understandably have to defend a bit this prospect of what they basically negotiated there. Well, I have the more luxury position being an outstander, and therefore being maybe a bit more able to contradict also with what they have agreed on. And I totally understand with what has been gained within the commission's work. And however, we can see that we need a very drastic changes in Germany, but also in other countries. These changes have to happen very fastly. What we also see is that political processes are relatively slow, especially in Germany, but also in other countries. It takes a lot of years. We're seeing now a coal commission that took half a year, which is really fast, but the legal process afterwards is 1.5 years in time, and we still haven't reached anything. So therefore, it's a very long process, and things are changing a lot. So if you would have told us that this is the compromise 5 years ago, all NGOs and climate activists would have signed this, would have said this is the best we can hope for. Now, in today's time, we're like, well, this is not even status quo. This is preserving the past. And this is basically, I think, the challenge that we have to see. Something that Philip highlighted a lot was there's a shift by the German government to choose a consensus approach, which I fully align. However, it's not only a consensus with coal companies, but it's also a consensus with all social actors that are involved within it. And something that I see very critically is within this draft of the German government, that nearly the majority of former coal commission members clearly state that if they would have seen this law the way that it is framed now, they maybe wouldn't have signed it. So therefore, even though the first draft of the recommendations by the coal commissions were kind of a consensus, I would say, however, the drafted law now has been changed by some forces more than by others, and therefore might not deliberate a real social consensus. And therefore, then I think this is not to be forgotten. It's still a first important step. Don't take me wrong on this, but there's still some things to adjust in the future.
Okay, before anyone else jumps in, I want to add the question from Jana Bosse, who asked if the compensation payments for lignite-fired power plants are compatible with EU subsidy law. And maybe also at this regard, do you expect maybe that the reality of the energy market is driving the coal phase out to an earlier year? And what does COVID-19, how does it impact the coal industry?
I think as with every legal aspect, you might have to ask different lawyers and they'll probably give you different answers on this. So basically, if you look at the past, I'm quite convinced that the German government will find a way to pay the compensation that they want to pay. It's not unlikely that certain other coal companies might sue the German state because they want additional payments. It is also more likely that these companies at a certain stage will withdraw their pleas if they get other compensations in another field. So therefore, this is what the past shows, is that if Germany wants to push something through, they will somehow manage to push it through within the European agenda. So therefore, it is totally understandable to know that this is to be decided by law, but I don't think that this will be an obstacle.
Janik, can you please repeat the second part of the question?
The second part was if COVID-19 has any impact on the coal industry.
I mean, what we're currently seeing is really a substantial drop in both production and power generation, especially both from hard coal and both from lignite. It's driven by lower demand due to the COVID crisis, but also very much driven by the low gas price, which means basically gas power plants are replacing coal and pushing them out of the markets, also reducing thereby the running hours of the power plants, and also decreasing then the, since the price at the wholesale market is significantly lower, also the revenues. This means that a lot of German coal-fired power plants, especially old hard coal plants and old lignite plants, are very much under pressure at the moment. The big bet towards the future is now basically how long will the status quo go on for the next weeks? Will we see the gas price jump back to its normal level already in the next few months? Or will we see the gas price switching back to its older levels in the next 2 or 3 years? If this situation goes on for the next 2 or 3 years, we'll probably see that a lot of coal capacities will be phased out, mainly due to market drivers. And on the other hand, if we see a switch back quite fairly soon, then then we might think that the additional phase-out measures in the phase-out law might make sense, or might still make sense.
Also, just very shortly, I think with respect to the lignite phase-out, COVID will not have such a big impact. Also, with respect to the compensation payments, it would be important for the government to highlight that things have changed due to COVID, but I think that they're not doing this sufficiently enough. So therefore, I think they might get too high compensation payments. With respect to hard coal, there will be certain bids, and so therefore the auctions might turn out cheaper. So therefore, hard coal will be affected more by COVID than lignite will.
Okay, so a question from Michael Kizierski. He asked, which role can the Bundesrat play in the legislation process regarding the change proposals which had been refused by the federal government? And if you could please explain the legislation process after the bill approval by the Bundestag.
Yeah, I've put the statement of the Bundesrat into the last slide, and the process is a little bit, so the Bundesrat makes proposals for changes. For example, they said, do more on renewables, and they also said, do more on CHP and give more money to hard coal-fired power plants. And then there's a reply from the German government, and then they say, we should take this on board, and we shouldn't take this on board. And on most of the issues, they said, yeah, we don't have to take anything new on board here. And so this reply from the government is also published, and I put the link in the last slide. But of course, you cannot know now what will be taken on board then finally. So maybe we can tell more when the law is finally approved.
Okay, so then we're getting to the next question from Alexander Reitzenstein. What is your take on the role of review moments in the phase-out law to accelerate ambition and not delay closures if current trends accelerate, including corona impacts, worsening economics and international politics, renewables rollout, higher EU targets, and mitigation, etc., or is it litigation?
In my understanding is that while we're currently deciding on this 2038 phase out, there will be the review points then which I'll find it likely that we at one point will decide for an earlier phase out towards 2035, because what we're currently seeing is basically with the entrance to the phase out that this is the momentum which is then starting to gain more and more gravity over time. Also, I think it's pretty likely when we see in the discussion on the level of the European Union with discussions on an increase of the European Union's climate targets in 2030, no matter how much higher, but in the end, it will obviously also have an effect on national climate targets. It will have an effect on the sharing within the ETS and non-ETS sector, what the actual targets are. So my best guess would actually be that the coal phase out in the next years will be further accelerated through to all kinds of different drivers, from policy perspective with more ambitious targets, from a market perspective. Also renewables are getting still getting cheaper, and taking all this together, I think it's rather more likely, or it's much more likely that the phase out will be done substantially earlier than 2038, even 2035, even though we still, the current law still is aiming for 2038.
Okay, so we also have a lot of question about Datteln Fork, the more controversial power plant. Let's start with one from Yasha Dave. The 1,100 megawatts Datteln Fork power plant owned by Uniper and located in Datteln in the North Rhine-Westphalia region opened despite the German government's stated plan. How do you think the transition will be realized? And maybe to add another question from Vera Kaupinen before you answer, are the additional auctions enough to compensate putting that online?
So let me take that question. So we've done some analysis basically showing that the additional replacement of that older units by Datteln will still lead to an increase of emissions in the later times. So basically in the first years, there's a shutdown of older coal units, which will be replaced by new, more modern coal power plants, which basically even might reduce emissions. However, in the end of the 2020s and the last times when the coal power plant is still running, we would assume that Datteln has higher capacity factor, so it runs more often during the year and therefore has a high utilization and more CO2 emissions. Overall, there might be higher CO2 emissions. However, I think the biggest negative aspect of Datteln 4 is not necessarily whether this is maybe 10 megatons of CO2 more or less, but this is more this international signal that Germany has joined the Powering Past Coal Alliance, and as one part of joining a Powering Past Coal Alliance is that you wouldn't allow new coal power plants to go online. And the strain of argument of the German government at the moment basically saying that this coal power plant was already ongoing, I think is a very vague statement. I can fully understand that they didn't manage to persuade Uniper not to put it online, but I think it's a very false signal. I still think that we still have to continue to fight against it, but I still think that we will not be that successful in doing so. But I think this.
Michael Buchsbaum asked about a brief history of Datteln 4, a rationale for why it is now on the grid after all, and what its fuel requirements are and its origins. And as it comes online, what types of energy is it displacing? How will this affect the coal phase out? And finally, since its two main customers are RWE and Deutsche Bahn, to what extent has Datteln affected these companies' green ambitions? Who wants to jump in?
Maybe I start and then someone else can follow up with things that I've missed. So basically, Datteln 4 is not a power plant that was supposed to, that was just, it has been planned already for a lot of years. I'm not exactly sure when exactly was the supposed first inauguration date, but it's a long time ago. It has been postponed for many times. There have been a lot of claims by NGOs basically stopping the inauguration. There has been problem with respect to the construction of the power plant. So it has been not a very positive story for the company itself, and the company has already invested a lot of money in this power plant. So basically there's a lot of sunk investment already happened. It is true that parts of the electricity that the power plant will provide is directly being sold to the Deutsche Bahn, to the German train company, which is of course not that good for a reputation of a company that tries to frame itself as a very green and renewable friendly transport company. So therefore I think this is especially a marketing problem. It is run on hard coal. This hard coal is being fully imported, so it depends a bit always where they get the cheapest coal from. And in most cases now it's, as I said, Colombia, South Africa, the US, or Russia. So therefore we are importing hard coal to keep this power plant running. Yeah.
Does anyone wants to add something about the Datteln topic? Otherwise, I would come to Johannes Eckert's question. Could post-coal regions like Lusatia become due to its huge federal funding real-life laboratories for shaping an innovative future region within the EU aims of energies from renewable sources and a circular bioeconomy? Anyone wants to look at the future of the coal region, Lusatia, maybe? Hauke?
Yes, I could answer that one. So, of course, there were two packages in the coal phase out. One was like on the climate aspects and decline of capacity. That's what we focused on. And then there's, of course, the second package, which we didn't address today so much, is like the compensation for the regions, which was, of course, very strong in the Commission because the regions were very present there. And end of last year, the Economic Ministry put out the plan to finance Reallabore. So this is something like a real life lab. And in the close to Schwarze Pumpe, which is a power plant in Lusatia, they will build a electrolyzer and the power plant running on hydrogen. So these plants are on the way, and they are financed via the so-called real labs.
Okay, so now we still have a lot of question open, still new coming in. Do you have any specific questions on the panel that you want to answer? Otherwise, we have some question about the Europe that go in the direction of Europe, which I would then go to next. For example, from Toma Pavlov, would Germany support the European Commission's proposal to raise the EU 2030 target to cut emissions by at least 50% towards 55% instead of the current target of 40%?
Angela Merkel has said in the Petersburg dialogue that she would fully support this pledge by the European Commission. So therefore, Germany officially is backing this push towards 50 to 55% reduction. My personal note on this is that this is not even enough, that we would need a stronger reduction to reach the Paris target. And that, of course, if we increase the target on the European level, we also have to increase the level of carbon reduction in Germany itself. So therefore, it is not enough to increase European levels, but of course, Germany also has to do their share, and maybe even a dominant share.
Maybe to quickly add on this, well, Angela Merkel has said that she's supporting that. The fraction of conservative parties said, yes, they would support this as well, but only if the national targets and the effort sharing and the UTS is then renegotiated, which was kind of, yeah, what they actually mean by that is that they only support that if it's completely renegotiated and Germany can stick with the target. Angela Merkel basically answered that she, of course, implied that this will be renegotiated. What that actually means, does it mean for Germany to increase its targets, which is would be more likely actually, and also necessary. Yeah, we see where that goes. Actually, it's a little bit bigger back and forth at the moment.
Okay, so another question in the direction of the EU: how does the German phase out from coal will impact the European energy system? A big broader question about it. Does it increase power generation from coal in neighboring countries, for example?
I would like to step on this. The first thing is, or at least that's my take. Happy to see what the colleagues think. If Germany reaches its fixed 65% renewables target, which goes hand in hand with the reduction of coal, then we could assume that the annual power generation of coal is mainly replaced by renewables. So when we just look at the production side, we see that there's no real shifting of emissions. The other element is then, of course, what happens to CO2 certificates and how much of them are actually being cancelled. With the ETS and the MSR in place, there's currently a huge discussion also among scientists how much of these free-floating, then additionally free-floating certificates are being sucked up by the market stability reserve, which would then in the end result that no additional emissions and free certificates will be in the market. Others claim that Germany has to additionally delete some of the certificates. So in the end, we can't really say it at the moment because it's relatively complicated to predict, but with the MSR in place and with also, especially meaning the 65 renewables targets, I think we could be rather confident that in the end, most of the actual reduction in coal doesn't have too much of an impact with emissions in other countries.
Also, maybe a side note, it is, I think, important also to say that Germany in the past has exported high shares of their electricity production. So when we are closing coal power plants, this doesn't mean that we are then importing a lot of electricity from other countries, but it first means that we are exporting less dirty electricity to our neighbors. But of course, in these other countries, also the energy transition needs to be enforced. So therefore, also we need a coal phase out not only in Germany, but in Europe.
Yes, that's way too. Also, our research shows that with the coal phase out, exports are reduced, and we export a lot of electricity to the Netherlands and to Southern Europe. And there we have a lot of gas-fired power plants. We have very few coal-fired power plants. So most of the production is replaced by natural gas power plants in the short term, and then by renewables in the long term. And that's also interestingly seen like today or in this year, because exports are going down a lot in this year, and gas-fired power plants in the Netherlands, for example, are running a lot more. And so this coal plants are producing more in other countries. We have never seen that in our research.
Okay, we also have some questions left about the most important lesson learned out of the German discussion on the coal phase out, for example, from Zala Princ. The Czech Republic has their own coal commission now, modeled after the German one, which is supposed to give recommendation in September. And Zala is wondering what key advice you would give to NGO members in it.
I think one of the first things is to understand in the German example when were important decisions being made, And the second thing is, if you're an NGO, when are you the strongest? And I would claim, but of course Philip and Hauke can contradict me because they were more directly involved. I would say the biggest decisions were being made basically in the last night of the coal commission itself. And then within the last year, throughout the legal process, through more bilateral discussions of actors, stakeholders, and the German government. And I would say that the strength of NGOs and climate activists does not merely lie in backdoor policy decision making and in the middle of the night, 2 o'clock in the night, to support them in some kind of way, but it more lies in pictures, in demonstrations, in climate activist campaigns, etc. So this is more a different format. So therefore, the strength of certain actors does not meet the preconditions of the game that is being played by others. So therefore, this is something that has to be thought of.
Maybe as a more general recommendation, I would say that it's important to start as early as possible, whatever we are talking about. We currently see that the economics have changed substantially, putting a lot of pressure on coal power plants and regions and so on, and therefore also to employment and so on and so forth. So no matter from which country you're looking, if you have a substantial coal sector, start the discussion on how to phase out coal as soon as possible, because markets are currently accelerating the development away from coal. And on the other hand, political processes take a whole lot of time. When we take the German example, I recall that the first bigger campaigns against coal started in the year 2005, 2007, something around that. And it took 15 to 13 years to agree on a coal phase out. Other countries have done it quicker, like the UK, but also the UK had some specific political economy structures there, I would argue. So most of the countries with bigger mining and coal sectors, I would assume policy processes probably take up more time. So start as soon as you can to discuss a phase out and how this should be organized.
Okay, time really flies, so I think we have time for one final question, and I would like to answer the one from Lyudmila Levitina. What studies are you working on right now, and what questions need to be answered now to ensure the success of the coal phase out? Maybe this is a good question to wrap up the Q&A session.
Okay, maybe if I start. So one study that we're working on is basically on the European perspective. So it's a European project, Horizon 2020 project, and we will present new scenarios on reaching carbon neutrality, not only by 2050, but even by 2040 in Europe. And we will present these modeling results in various stages, but one way will be also, I think, next week already being published from Monday onwards. So we will have certain discussions with certain members of the EU Parliament also, but then also present it publicly to some people. If you're interested, just contact me. Then we have an ongoing research project, basically examining the work of the German Coal Commission. This is more an academic work and trying to understand a bit more the drivers and hurdles of this process. And one last but not least, we have a project on gender aspects in respect to the coal phase out, because I think these are being under examined until now.
Philip, Hauke, you want to add one more sentence about your work?
Only one sentence. We're currently working on a study together with our partners at Forum Energie on what it actually means to phase out lignite simultaneously in Germany, Poland, and the Czech Republic. And we're going to publish the result, what it means for the power sector of those three countries now over the summer.
Yeah, I have to say that I don't work so much on coal in the last weeks because other sectors are coming, like industry that want to be decarbonized. And we also work a little bit on combined heat and power because, I mean, in electricity, I think it's very clear where decarbonization goes, but heat production and also industry is not so clear. That's where we put a little bit more focus on now.
Okay, so thank you very much for this very vivid Q&A session. Sorry for those questions we couldn't answer. And now it's 12:30 and I'm handing back to Nicola. Thank you.
Thank you, Janne, for dealing with all those incoming questions and also for answering them. I think this time we managed almost 40. So that only leaves us some 20 which are unanswered. If they are really pressing and you really can't go without the answer, you can still contact us and send us an email to webinar@agora-energiewende.de and I will forward those. Thanks for the presentations, Hauke, Philip, and Pao Yu. I think it was very interesting. I myself did enjoy it. Thank you very much for that. And this is it for webinars from Agora Energiewende or within this series for this week. But we do have one planned for next Thursday, and this will be published on our website tomorrow. The best way to stay in touch and be updated throughout the time is to subscribe for our newsletter, the recording of today's webinar, and I hope this time it will look better than the last time we recorded a Zoom webinar. It was really horrible. I have no idea what Zoom did. Apparently they did change some of the settings. Today it looked good on my control computer, and I hope it will be as such in the recording. It will be online probably also already at the end of this week, otherwise at the beginning of next week. So if you want to rewatch it or share it with someone you think is interested in, do so. And yes, have a good day, have a good rest of the day, have a good week, stay healthy, still keep the distance, please, because I don't think it's over, even though everything looks a bit more normal now. And yes, we see you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.